Recently, while playing with some concepts in my sketchbook, I stumbled across a spark of inspiration while drawing a tiny snail. I started to imagine the shell transformed into a fantastical world, complete with a cabin, a forest, and a river that cascades off the side into a waterfall. Hello and welcome, my name is Jason, and today we're going to be turning this concept into a gouache painting. Along the way, I'll be sharing some of my process, some stories, and some fun facts. So, without further ado, let's get started. In my last video, I talked about the challenges of working with gouache at a large scale, but this time I'm going to give it another try on a slightly more manageable size. So today, I'll be working on an 18 by 14 panel with the same 140-pound Arches watercolor paper. Like before, I've adhered the paper to the board using some archival PVA glue. I'll also prepare the surface by drawing out guiding lines using the golden ratio. I'll explain more in detail what this ratio is and how it operates in my painting later in the video, but for now, just know these are guiding lines that help me to arrange my composition. Before jumping into painting, I started by planning out the scene and lighting using a 3D modeling program called Blender. While complete overkill for this project, Blender allowed me to visualize the placement of objects in a three-dimensional space while simulating them with realistic lighting. I mainly sourced free assets while only having to make minor alterations to the snail to fit the pose I was looking for. I did have to generate the rocks myself, but I found several tutorials online that did the trick. After finishing the design in Blender, I started on the drawing. Early on, I could tell that this image needed something extra to round it out, so I decided to draw the snail lower in the composition to allow space for whatever else I had in store. What I soon realized is my snail needed a friend. From here, I jumped into Procreate to test out some additional designs. Finally, I settled on an image of a toad, which I thought would be the perfect friend for my snail. So the lines in my paper are actually guiding lines calculated using the golden ratio, otherwise known as the Fibonacci sequence. The Fibonacci sequence is a pattern found commonly throughout nature, such as in shells, plants, and even some animals. Because of the abundance of this sequence, many artists throughout history have arranged their compositions using this pattern. Humans are naturally attracted to this sequence, leading images composed in this way to feel more naturally aesthetic. If I overlay the sequence over the top of my sketch, you'll see that I've arranged several elements to line up with the divisions of the ratio. First, I like to have the horizon line, the line where the sky meets the ground, to lie on one of these horizontal divisions seen here. If we spin the sequence around, you'll notice that I positioned the toad's eyes, which are two focal points in my image, on the primary division line. While I don't adhere to this ratio perfectly, I still often use it to help me arrange my subjects on the canvas within some sort of aesthetic order. Most often, artists will arrange their focal points to be exactly where the spiral terminates, while others will arrange the major landmarks along the division lines like I have. This sequence is similar to the rule of thirds, where the image is divided into thirds. In this rule, it is suggested that compositions are naturally more aesthetic when focal points or landmarks are aligned within these divisions. In art, there are many principles that can feel like rules you have to follow to create a successful piece. While understanding these principles is important, what's even more valuable is learning how to bend and break them to suit the story you're trying to tell. Instead of letting these guidelines restrict you, it's about knowing when and where to use them to serve your vision. After completing the drawing, I brought the panel over to the easel and started to work on the sky. One thing that I found out right away was that working on this heavyweight watercolor paper, I was actually able to blend out some of the transitions using my finger. As long as the paint was still wet, I found that with soft pressure I could gently blend some of the colors together. I still have to do some testing to see if this method is feasible on lighter weight paper, but for now I was happy to add this new method to my arsenal. Next is the clouds. Oftentimes different paint media can change the workflow of your painting. With oils, it's important to block in the dark colors before the lights because light colors tend to have a higher tinting strength than the darks, meaning that it's much easier to lighten colors than to darken. With watercolor, artists often work from light to dark because watercolor is transparent, meaning that adding light colors over dark is often not an option. Since gouache is a much more opaque form of watercolor, layering colors is much more of a possibility, granted that the paper can only accept so many layers. This means that in gouache, painting light to dark or dark to light is circumstantial. In the clouds, I'm working from light to dark because I want to maintain the bright highlights of the clouds without dimming them down. While gouache is not fully opaque, like with watercolor, it is still hard to layer bright highlights on top of something dark. When painting landscapes, I like to start with the furthest elements away and work my way forward, gradually building up the scene around my subjects. As objects recede into the distance, their tonal contrast shifts, and their color spectrum changes due to atmospheric perspective. This effect occurs because light scatters as it travels through the atmosphere, which is why distant mountains often appear blue. The atmosphere scatters blue light more than any other color, making mountains seem bluer the further they are away. Yellow light, on the other hand, doesn't pass through the atmosphere as well, so it's usually the first color to fade as objects recede. To simulate atmospheric perspective in my painting, I not only reduce the tonal contrast as elements move further back, but I also desaturate colors, especially the yellows and the greens, to create the illusion of depth while painting these distant trees. In addition, as elements move forward like the grass, I slowly start to incorporate more yellow. My snail's friend here is a Great Plains toad native to central and southwestern regions of the United States. They are often seen with olive and pale brown patterns and live primarily in grasslands, deserts, and floodplains. They have spurs on their hind legs as they often dig themselves burrows. A fun fact is that all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. This is because toad is a classification of frog. Within the order of Anora, there are several families of frogs, one being true frog. The Great Plains toad is a species within this family, so more confusingly, the Great Plains toad is not only considered a frog, but a true frog, but still somehow a toad. More commonly, frogs and toads can be differentiated because frogs tend to leap, while toads tend to walk. I like to imagine that the snail and the toad are great friends and have been wandering the grasslands together for a while now. Like in many of my paintings, I like to draw animals at an unusual size, imagining that there's some sort of catastrophic event that occurred within our world, causing many animals to become ginormous. A more reasonable explanation would be that Earth's atmosphere has since developed an abundance of oxygen, causing animals, especially insects like in my butterfly paintings, to become gigantic. Researchers have found fossil records of ginormous insects during the Carboniferous and Permian era. Knowing that back then oxygen levels were much higher than they are currently, researchers were able to determine that many animals were able to grow larger in proportion to the oxygen levels. While insects back then were not nearly as large as the butterflies in my paintings, I still find this to be an interesting rationale behind my gigantic animal motifs. After completing the toad, I moved on to the snail. This snail is known as Jeremy. In addition to the landscape atop his back, Jeremy is unique because he is one of few garden snails to have a rare condition that causes his shell to coil to the left instead of the right. Jeremy was a particular snail studied at the University of Nottingham and was named after British Labour politician Jeremy Corbyn because of his left-leaning political views and love for gardening. In the majority of snails, the shell coils to the right, but this snail in particular was discovered and brought to the university. What researchers initially believed to be a rare mutation turned out to reveal genes associated with body asymmetry, offering a chance for researchers to develop new understandings of how organs are placed in the human body. I chose to fill in the subjects before the water, as I wanted a better sense of how they would reflect on the water before I started painting them. Here, I had to work very quickly to make sure that the blue and the dark reflections would blend neatly together. I then moved on to the candle on top of the toad's head. I guess at this point the toad needs a name too. I'll call him Puddles. Today, Puddles is celebrating his birthday with Jeremy. I like to imagine that after the two of them devoured an entire cake, Puddles decided to parade around with a candle on top of his head. I'm not sure why, but I think this adds something whimsical to the painting, seeing the toad with a candle atop his head. Also, a little bit of a sense of danger, considering that it's still lit. From there, I moved on to the landscape on Jeremy's shell. I've always loved miniatures, which I think came from my love for building Legos as a kid. But this has surfaced recently as a fascination with little worlds, complete with their own stories and histories. Despite the animals being so ginormous, the world on top Jeremy's shell is like its own secluded world. That makes me wonder, who lives there? Who built this cabin and bridge? What are their names? I'm sure I could make up a whole story and history behind the cabin and its inhabitants, but I'd also love to maintain the mystery and wonder for the viewer. And with the final finishing touches on the little log cabin, I can officially call this painting complete. Overall, I had a really fun time with this project. I really liked how the lighting turned out, and I'm kind of glad that I took the extra step to model the scene in Blender. Regardless, I hope that you had an enjoyable time, and I hope to see you in the next video.